3, 2.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to our fifth topic, where we're going to be discussing delivery channel risk. Yeah, sure, you guys have been in quite a few sessions and it is the early morning start, so I do see people are trickling in. So I'll try extend the introduction as long as I can, so that by the time we get started with the session, we have a full group. So in any event, welcome. Thanks again for taking the time out. This is the second last session that we're going to be hosting. It's also the second last risk topic that we're discussing. And it's funny that my phone makes beeps as I start talking, so let me just put it on silent. I apologize for that. This morning has been a bit of a chaos. Be it as it may, for those of you who haven't maybe attended or haven't seen one of our sessions, my name is Ashley Moy. I'm here at the FIC and I look after guidance and awareness. And as always, I'm joined by my team in the background who's going to be assisting. And there's Karaba Sachano, who is our producer today, to make sure that the session goes smoothly. I'm also going to introduce you then to my colleague Spoo a little bit later, who is going to be taking you through the bulk of the presentation. So as every event starts, we do have an attendance register in the Q&A slot. Please, if you wouldn't mind filling out the attendance register so long. The purpose behind the attendance register is obviously from an audit perspective. We need to be able to evidence that today's session took place and who attended. And then also we use these attendance registers so we know who to send confirmation of attendance to. You will also then receive a copy of today's presentation. So if you could just quickly fill that in for us. There will be a Q&A session also at the end of today's session. We do foresee this one being a little bit shorter than the previous session. So if we do end a little bit earlier, don't be worried. It's not because we're flying through the material. It's just a shorter session. And then we will have that Q&A. So send your queries throughout, and then we can always pause for the Q&A at the end. I'm also then going to ask for you to take 5 minutes. I see it's 3 minutes past 8, just to fill out the pre-session questionnaire for us. Like all the other ones, it's just a few questions for us just to gauge your understanding on this particular topic. And then at the end of the session, so in tomorrow's session is going to be a little bit longer questionnaire that we're going to give you time to complete at the end of the session, just so that we can gauge the effectiveness of the risk program. So that link should be up also in the Q&A functionality, if not already. Let me just check if it is there. Yes, thank you so much, Karaba. Karaba has linked it up for us. It's labeled the pre-session questionnaire link. I'll give you 5 minutes. So at 8:08, we will get started with the session. And again, as the people start coming in, I'll just remind them to quickly answer the questionnaire for us. Just a reminder, we are going to keep this information safe. You do not need to provide us with your name in the questionnaire. No one's going to see what your results are. It is anonymous. The only information that we're asking for is the industry that you come from. That just allows us then to, dissect the information a little bit later, so we know then which areas we need to target and which industries we need to target. So I'm going to keep quiet, turn my camera off, and give you a few moments then just to go through the questionnaire. For those of you who have just joined us, we've got 3 more minutes left just to fill out both the attendance register and also please the pre-session questionnaire The links are available in the Q&A chat, the published chats. Okay, so the time has just gone 8 past now. That's our 5 minutes is up. For those of you who might have joined a little bit late, just a reminder then that the questionnaire link and the attendance register link has been posted, so you're most welcome then while we get started with the session just to fill out the questions for us. So let's get into today's session. So with all the other sessions, what we're going to do is just give you a very quick recap of where we are, why we're talking about this, very quickly touching on the FATF and the findings. So it's if anything, at the end of the session, if you've attended all the topics, you're going to know it very well, so you'll probably be able to present the slides as well. But just for the sake of context, for those of you who might not have attended a session, we're going to just quickly go over that background. Then I'm going to hand over to Spoo, and Spoo is going to be taking you through the FIC issued guidance on delivery channel and on the risk-based approach in general, and then focusing on the sector risk assessments, and then also providing some international best practice, specifically on delivery channel. I think before we get started in anything, this particular risk item, you're going to notice there's quite an overlap, specifically when it comes to your customer due diligence controls, as well as your product offering. And the reason being, you know, when we get into it is when we're talking delivery channel, we're really talking about how you engage with your client, how your client uses your product, how you present your product, you know, what kind of platforms do you engage with your clients? Are there intermediaries involved? Do you deal directly with your client? Do you do you know, selfie engagements or online engagements through through social media, etc. So this is kind of the space that we're dealing in. In the DNFBP sector, there is a possibility for you not to have face-to-face contact. It feels weird today to say it, given that you know, there's no more COVID controls, or there's not no COVID controls, but there's a serious relaxation of it. But your business models might have changed over the last 2 years. You might have been in a space where you could only engage with your client on a face-to-face basis, and now you can find yourself, you know, either doing Zoom calls or team meetings. I've even heard of people looking at houses through a WhatsApp call, and the agent was taking the person through the house. Actually, friends of mine, and they purchased the property, you know, actually through looking through a WhatsApp call. Yeah, so the world has changed. It really is a little bit different now. So this topic might be not so relevant going forward necessarily, but definitely if your model has changed over the past couple of years. All right. The sources that are relevant then for today's session, you'll know in all the presentations in the beginning, we give you all the links. So these are the sources that we consulted when we were putting together the presentation. There's the Mutual Evaluation Report and Guidance Note 7, as well as the FIC Act. So those remain the constants. Then there's PCC 43. So not directly related to the link, but definitely related to the topic. And this PCC talks about customer due diligence on shared clients. So this is really that instance where, if I can maybe use like an estate, keep calling them estate agents, a property practitioner, legal practitioner, where there's a shared mandate in respect of the same client. How is it, who is responsible for what, and that's what this PCC talks to. And then the last one then on FATF guidance is relating to the digital identity. Now the digital identity is exactly that. So it's no longer that face-to-face engagement, that classic old school, I see you, I give you a copy of my ID book, or you take a photo of my ID book or driver's license, whatever the case may be. This is really around when you do engage with someone on an online platform, and how they then provide you with information through this online platform, and then all the risks associated to that. I think the most obvious one that everyone immediately jumps to is fraud, fake identity, etc., and how that then can filter through to understanding the money laundering risk presented in that. So from a FATF perspective, and again, I'm going to rapid fire over these slides. The FATF is the Financial Action Task Force. They're that international intergovernmental body, and they set standards. These standards specifically are, if implemented, will assist in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing and counter-proliferation financing. There are 37 member jurisdictions. South Africa is the only African member to the FATF. The FATF, as part of being a member, we get tested against them. So it's kind of like a peer review, two different kinds of reviews. You get a technical review, excuse me, and you also get effectiveness. The technical review is they have a look at their recommendations. There's 40 recommendations, and they see how our legislative framework holds up to those recommendations. So do we have structures in place? Do we have legislation in place? Do we have customer due diligence, etc.? That's technical. Then they test us from an effectiveness perspective, and effectiveness really refers to, all right, so how are you doing? How effective is your legislative framework? Is it actually going towards anti-money laundering? Are you actually combating terrorist financing, etc.? So it really tests, how effective the system actually is. We went through this review in 2019. It was a technical assessment as well as an effectiveness assessment. And then those results got released in 2021. You'll see there table 1 talks to the immediate outcomes. The immediate outcomes that are relevant for your sector really relates to immediate outcome 4, and that talks to preventative measures. And preventative measures really are those controls that get put in place by accountable institutions that, well, we refer to them as accountable institutions, and they really are your controls or your mitigants. The most important parts, I would say, in IO4 talks to risk, the understanding of risk. So how do you identify it? How do you understand it? How do you mitigate, manage and control those particular risks? And then those controls also then are included in your preventative measures, and that relates to things like your customer due diligence, your profiling of a client, monitoring of a client, submitting reports through to the FIC. IO3 then, or immediate outcome 3, talks to supervision. And this is really, this is kind of our baby, and this talks to how do we supervise, and supervision is all encompassing. It goes from awareness, guidance, inspections, enforcement, which is like penalties, etc. So it's that full spectrum. The second table then refers to the technical compliance ratings, and there you'll see they're broken down into 40 because they relate to the 40 recommendations. And we definitely wanted to see a C against everything which tells us that we're compliant. NC is non-compliant. Luckily, we don't have too many of them, but unfortunately, we do still have some. All right. In terms of immediate outcome 4, then remember this is the preventative measures. This is really where you guys sit in. And when I say you guys, I'm talking to designated non-financial business and professionals, or DNFBPs for short. We break it up into financial institutions and DNFBPs. So From a DNFBP sector, I just want to zone into the bottom there where it was highlighted, where there was a lack of understanding in terms of a risk-based approach, both from a business risk assessment, new products and processes, and client level risk. And that's really what this program is aiding to assist you with. So today's session is kind of going to slot then in the business risk assessment. So really, how do you understand your business? And I know we harped on it in topic 2, I beg your pardon, in topic 1, is if you don't understand the risk facing your entity within your industry, how is that risk going to then trickle down, and how are you going to be able to understand and have a risk tolerance and understand what you're willing to accept? And also importantly, how then do you go granular and actually apply this risk understanding to your clients? The last thing that I wanted to mention just on the recommendations. So recommendation 1, or the fact of recommendation 1, is incorporated into the FIC Act in terms of section 42. Recommendation 1 is all encompassing in the sense that it talks to having a risk understanding, so identifying, assessing, managing, mitigating risks from a national perspective, from a sectoral perspective, and then also granular at a client level perspective. A lot of the information in today's session comes from the sector risk assessments. It also comes from the guidance, and this really talks to the supervisory body and the regulatory body's understanding of the risk facing certain products, facing certain accountable institutions within your respective industries. So it's not just, we also have to practice what we preach. We can't say you need to apply risk. We need to also understand the risk your industry faces so that we can assist you in applying your risk methodology. All right, I believe that's where my story ends. I hope that was a quick enough recap. And I'm going to pause here and hand over to my colleague, Sibusiso Dlamini. Spu is a Senior Compliance Officer here at the FIC. He's also in the guidance and awareness space. And I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you, Spu.
Thank you very much, Ash. Colleagues, welcome. And then I think that's thank you very much to Ashley for doing such a detailed presentation on us catching up on what we require to do. So I'm going to take you through what we discussed on the previous sessions when we were sitting, and then in these sessions. So we're just going to have a small recap on the risk-based approach. So these are items that we discussed initially on the first day when we set to have this workshop. So we're going to start by looking at the RMCP. What does the RMCP entail, and then the risk assessment and rating that is related to the RMCP. This is detailed in section 42(2)A of the FIC Act, where we are required to identify, assess, monitor, mitigate, manage the risk that the provision of goods and services by the accountable institution may involve or facilitate money laundering or terrorist financing, including proliferation financing. This is supposed to be done in a manner that is clear in the RMCP document, and then these risks should be labeled, and then the accountable institution should understand what this risk entails to their business and the type of environment that they are functioning under. They also need to implement reasonable measures proportionate to the risk that they have identified, and then they need to accurately assess the risk that is involved. They also have to take into account an informed decision on the basis of the risk assessment as to the appropriate methods, controls, measures that are going to put in place, and the levels of verification that should be applied in a given circumstance. So you need to understand it, and then you need to make sure that you know how you're going to deal with it, and how you're going to resolve or mitigate the risk that you have. In many instances, when it comes to risk, people say that you can't totally eradicate risk in your environment. You can minimize it, control it, and then manage it. So that's what is required of accountable institutions through the RMCP, where you put a plan in place that will show how do you deal with these aspects relating to risk. And then we have 5 forms of risk that you can look at when it comes to the risk management compliance program. We have product and services risk, delivery channel risk, and geographic area risk, client type, and other factors that might not be indicated from this slide that you might be aware of as an accountable institution. So when conducting risk assessment and risk rating framework, when you look at products and services, what factors that you can look at? Third-party payments, if you are not dealing with a person directly, but there's a third-party payment that you receive for the transaction that you engage in. Is it a cash or electronic fund transfer? Is the cross-border transfer? Is the transaction happening in one country, two countries, multiple countries? And what risk is that environment or those countries that are dealing with pose to the transaction or the client comes with from those countries? What can you identify as a risk from cross-border flow of transaction or money? The duration of a relationship between the business and the client. So in most instances, you tend to know people better when you spend more time with them, and then you have a longer term business relationship than someone that you see once off and then you never see the person again. The next one that we're going to look at is delivery channels, which is our topic for today. So we're going to give you more details on delivery channels on the following slides, but what you have to look at in a high level is direct relationship, working through intermediary, face-to-face or non-face-to-face. Tomorrow we'll be discussing geographic area risk. So the people or the transaction that is happening, is it from South Africa or a foreign country, or the people that are dealing with, are they from South Africa or a foreign jurisdiction? The countries that are dealing with, or the people that are dealing with from countries with a high risk level, it could be anything from sanctions. The countries from the sanctioned countries or the individuals themselves sanctioned. Client confidentiality in foreign jurisdiction, the laws relating to the relationship in the client if you're dealing with a client from another jurisdiction. Are you dealing with someone who comes from a weak regulatory environment, oversight, the country's supervisory bodies or the legislations and regulations from that specific country are not robust enough to deal with money laundering related issues? And then client type, are you dealing with a natural person or a legal person? We'll touch this again a bit later on the following slides. Complex structures of the entity when you're dealing with legal persons. Is it a simple structure, a one-man show? Is it a SEC or a complexly structured company? Prominence of the individual that you're dealing with. Is he a politically exposed person? Is he a business of a social high standard? Or is a person maybe coming from a royal house? So those are the issues that you need to understand and look at when you're dealing with the client. Adverse information, and then we'll touch at this again a bit later, where you look at what information is available, readily available to the client that they're dealing with. Negative media, are there issues relating to money laundering or terrorist financing and proliferation financing relating to the individual or the client or a legal person that you're dealing with? Or any supervisory bodies have issued findings against that specific person. Transaction pattern. If you are in a long relationship with a client, you know what types of transactions occur in your environment. And then when the pattern of transaction drastically changes, and then for an unexplainable reason, there should be a question why such activity is taking place, and then why is the client having these form of transactions at the moment. Other factors, and then that you can look at is money laundering approach from the entity or the business, sanctions, as we mentioned a bit earlier, strategy of entity, regulatory fines in similar industries, learnings and typologies. Now, colleagues, we're going to show you a risk matrix, which is an illustration or an example that you can look at when you are formulating your risk-based approach and drafting your RMCP or risk management compliance program. We've taken the 5 factors that we discussed on the previous slides, and then we risk-rated them with a score of 3, 2, and 1, where we gave a 3 for high risk, and 2 for medium risk, and 1 for a low risk. So the client type that we have, the first client type that we have a natural person. So a natural person has a tendency of being a low risk client, but we'll go in detail on the following slides on some example on how we maybe look at the examples and what trends informs this scoring. So we have a client type who is a natural person, we score them a 1. A product type, that is a luxury car paid in cash, and then we score it a 3. A geographic area, Zimbabwe, we score it a 3, and then there could be different reasons why you score the geographic area 3. It could be because when you deal with Zimbabwe, some individuals from Zimbabwe are sanctioned. So you have to be aware of such factors affecting the place, the region, the geographic area that you're dealing with, and then you should know and check if the clients that you're working with are on the sanctions list or not. Delivery channel risk, is it face-to-face, the relationship that you are establishing, or any other ongoing transactions that we have with the client? Are we having them on social media, as Ashley mentioned a bit earlier? And then are we having them over the telephone or any other platform? Is it an email or any other platform that is available these days? Other factors, the individual is unemployed, and then you score the individual at 3. When we add all those scores, they give us an overall rating of a 13, which is a high risk. So you need to put measures in place to control that environment. Legal entity. The second client type that we have is a legal entity, and then we score them a 2, and then we'll give a detail again on the following slides on why we think that it should be a 2. But you should, at all times, look at your environment, look at the factors applicable to your space, apply them according to what you understand in your environment, the client types in your environment, the product type in your environment, geographic area risk, delivery channel risk, and other factors. So the product type for the second example is digital coins. Digital coins, you score them at 3 for obvious reasons, that it is a new product that has not been actually structured, that has not been regulated in some spaces, in some countries, and in some places. So that's what you have to look at, and then you have to score it according to the risk that you identify for the specific product type that you have. Geographic area is Botswana. Botswana is known to be a least risky country when it comes to money laundering, so we score them a 1. Delivery channel, this one is a face-to-face. It's easier if you see the person that you're dealing with, or the individual that you're dealing with. You'll be able to ask questions when sometimes you can't ask when you're dealing with the individual face-to-face. And some other factors and trends show that the risk related to a face-to-face transaction is lower than a risk that will be associated with a non-face-to-face transaction. Other factors is occupational sector. This one, we have blood diamonds. So the thing that comes into mind is places like Botswana, they're close to DRC, and they're close to some West African countries who are associated with blood diamonds. So there's a risk that you have to look at as well. So the score that we gave for that is a 3. So the overall rating score is 10, which equates to a medium risk. So you should put measures in place that relate to a medium risk rating as well. And then we are continuing from the previous examples that we showed you on the risk matrix on the previous slide. So now we are saying that what do you have to look at for product and delivery risk channel, because they are intertwined. As Ashley mentioned a bit later, you can't separate them, that we are only going to look at a delivery channel risk, and automatically that will give you a full idea of the risk score for your entity. So you must look at all them wholly, and then don't just look at one factor, and then don't forget that you have to apply your mind into your space, your sphere, and the times that you are operating in. So accountable institutions, the first part that we're going to look at is list, indicator, and characteristics example. So the first one, we have a delivery channel type, which we have where we have an intermediary, and then the trends indicate higher susceptibility when you deal with a third party, whether it's an agent or an intermediary, than when you're dealing with the client directly, because you won't know the person behind the transaction if you're dealing with an intermediary. If you complete all the transactions with the intermediary, there'll be a higher risk that you might miss some other things that would be obvious when you deal with an individual directly. For example, if you're dealing with a sanctioned person through an intermediary, it won't be easily identifiable that you're dealing with a sanctioned person. And then subject, this type of channel risk is susceptible to criminals, and then using it to launder money in different ways. So the rating that we assign to this type of channel risk is a 3. Delivery channel type phase 2, that's what we are discussing, is a non-phase 2 phase engagement between the client and the business or an accountable institution. And on this one as well, international and domestic trends show higher susceptibility to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation risk, where you won't be able to identify a beneficial owner who is the one that would be one body behind the transaction, or the person who has a controlling power on the transaction that are entering to it. And criminals as well use it to launder money in different ways. And the score that we associated that we gave to it is a 3. And then the last one is a face-to-face, as we mentioned on the previous slide. That indicates a lower susceptibility to money laundering because you know the person behind the transaction, you know the one body behind the engagement that you are having with the client. The score that we gave to that one is a 1. So what sources can be used to identify and assess delivery channel risk? Trends and typologies is the first one, and FATF guidance on factor. FATF guidance, the links that we showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So you can go to the FATF website and look at what they are proposing or they are suggesting that you have to look at as a factor that might relate to channel risk. FIC guidance on a factor, for example, guidance note 7, and including draft guidance note 7A, FIC draft PCC 114, FIC sector risk assessment information that we are going to highlight a bit later in this presentation. International and domestic trends, what's happening internationally and inside the country. When you look at corruption, for example, what trends are we seeing in the country? What type of people are more engaged in corruption, and what types of activities? And then what types of products, channels, and the places that they come from. So that's what we have to look at. And then open source information, a basic task that I always mention during this time, or at this point of the presentation, is that a simple exercise like Googling your client and just checking if there's any information that is readily available to the public, like, for example, a report that has been released on a specific item. Media reports and so forth. Supervisory body advice, what the FIC say on the matter, including other supervisory bodies. If you are dealing with international clients, also look at the jurisdictions where those clients are coming from. Are there any supervisory body, is there any supervisory body information that relates to the type of transaction that are entering into? Or are there any findings against the client that you're dealing with from the jurisdiction that the client is coming from? And any other considerations that might have an impact on the relationship and the transaction that you are engaging or entering into. So, and then the definition of a delivery channel is that delivery channel refers to the means by which institutions and clients interact with each other. How is it done? In the offering of products and services, or during onboarding of clients and the usage of the products and services themselves. So these are 3 key things that maybe you have to look at when you're looking at the delivery channel risk. And then now we're going to look at the guidance of delivery channel definitions. So product risk is very closely associated with delivery channels, as we mentioned a couple of times in this presentation. So we're going to look at customer due diligence, which is really closely linked to client risk. But what you have to look at is the situation where a person is acting on behalf of a client. So there should be a question mark when a person is dealing on behalf of a client. Is there an agency agreement in place? That's a question you need to ask when you're analyzing the risk that the client poses. Is this a shared client? Does the client information tie up with the delivery channel? And is the associated customer due diligence appropriate? Or depending on the risk. If the client is high risk, now we have to look at additional due diligence or enhanced due diligence, and the timelines or time frames. When are you going to conduct due diligence on a high risk client? And you should put measures in place as well for medium and then a lower risk clients, because the situation might change. You might take on the client at according to the analysis, it's low risk, and circumstances changes over a period of time, whether it's a year, 2 years, 6 months, 3 months. And that's why you have to conduct due diligence so that you determine whether the risk is still the same between you and the client or the products and all other factors that relate to channel risk. Does client information tie up with the delivery channel, and is the associated customer due diligence appropriate? As we mentioned, does the delivery channel make sense given the client relationship and product offering? So colleagues, again, just take a step back and just think on the way that you can enhance your risk management compliance program so that it details exactly what risk entails for your business. And then in a very highly unlikely event that a supervisory body or an FIU comes knocking at your door requesting to see your risk management compliance program, it will be detailed enough that it covers the aspects that are highlighted in these workshops that we're having, that we're having in these 2 weeks. So we're continuing again looking at delivery channel risk assessment. And then what's saying again, take a step back and just consider that is the product offered to prospective clients directly or through intermediaries. That's why you're saying that no, these factors are intertwined. They are similar for product risk, they're similar for delivery channel risk, they're similar for other risks that you might identify within your organization. Are prospective clients onboarded through non-face-to-face processes, and or do they use the institution's products and services through non-face-to-face transactions? Are prospective clients onboarded through direct interaction or through intermediaries? Do clients transact by engaging with the institution directly or through intermediaries? Or where clients interact through intermediaries, are the intermediaries subject to licensing or other regulatory requirements? And then you should also ask yourself, to what extent does the usage of the product require the participation of institution or the application of the institution's systems and transaction platforms? Or what are the payment systems or other technological platforms that support the functioning of the product? Are products and services acquired or transactions performed via an exchange? Are products and services traded in secondary markets? Because now, if they're in secondary market, not in primary or direct market, you might not see what's happening in the background. So that's a question that might pose a risk for the type of business that you are engaging. Now, colleagues, we're going to look at the factor at the FIC sector risk assessment, where we're going to look at what were some items that are highlighted for property practitioners, legal practitioners, and the gambling sector. So we're going to start by looking at legal practitioners and property practitioners. These are the factors that were identified by the FIC sector assessment that was issued sometime in March this year. So delivery channels that may obscure or conceal the true identity of the client, or that result in the client not being onboarded face-to-face, may increase the risk of the NFBPs being abused for criminals to launder the proceeds of crime. The NFBPs, colleagues, you should remember that Ashley mentioned them a bit earlier. They are designated non-financial businesses and professionals. So that would include property practitioners, legal practitioners, and legal practice and TCSPs, which are trust company services providers. So as we're sitting here, that's what was identified during the mutual evaluation that Ashley mentioned to a bit earlier, that people in the space of the NFBPs are not aware of these risks, and then they need to maybe do more in their environment and space to cap the shortcoming that is posed by the identified factors or identified risk. So what we look at is where an intermediary is used to onboard clients, and the NFBP must do a proper due diligence on the intermediary and its business, and must be familiar with the risk mitigation process and procedure the intermediary may have. And also, they need to look at the payment of funds to a third party. Could be done to disguise the sources of funds and certain assets. When such situation occur, an accountable institution in the position of a DNFBP, in order to mitigate the risk, should always ensure that it understands the source of funds and the reasons for constructing the transaction. So you don't only look at the intermediary when you are engaging in such a business. You should also look at the person who is behind the transaction. So you look at the mediator, the intermediary, and then you also look at the ultimate beneficial owner. So when you're conducting customer due diligence, don't only finish conducting customer due diligence for the intermediary, but also go down to the represented person that the intermediary is acting on his or her behalf. So that's what we need to remember as well, colleagues. So now we're continuing with legal practitioners and property practitioners factors that were highlighted by the Financial Intelligence Center risk assessment. So we also need to use the use of technology in advertising services and conduct businesses where the NFBPs who advertise their services on social media platforms and or who are considering conducting business with clients via social media platforms must be aware of the potential higher risks associated with less stringent verification requirements of social media. So in social media, it sometimes tends to be difficult. And then in some instances, we mentioned a bit earlier that when you have to do verification and identification, someone will request that you just send a photo of your identification document. In some instances, it's easier to obscure the true identity of a person if you're sending a picture in an unverified format. So we need to be aware of such risks and then put measures and controls in place to make sure that the true information that is the true nature of the information that is sent to us is what is reflected and what is required as an application that is put on us by the Financial Intelligence Center Act. And then that also happens where social media platforms are used to share information on products or services or to onboard clients. A legal practitioner, for example, must ensure that such clients are properly identified and verified and that all the relevant information pertaining to the risk posed by clients is obtained or identified. And then now we're continuing again. We have a significant example of potential money laundering risk. This is what was said actually on the sector risk assessment, where a risk associated with delivery channels is introduced to a client through a property practitioner to provide a property transfer service. In such an instance, the legal practitioner can mitigate the risk associated with the use of an intermediary by verifying the property practitioner whether the property practitioner is registered with the property practitioners authority, regulatory authority, and it complies with relevant legislation. And also that might include during the risk assessment verification of the good standing of a property practitioner, introducing a client with mitigating that will mitigate the potential risk of property transaction not being on arm's length basis to facilitate the transfer of funds or to hide the origins of funds, trying to evade money laundering or any other legislation related to evasion of complying with the applicable laws. Now we're going to look at the gambling sector. We're going to look at what factors were highlighted for the gambling sector. The first one was the use of alternative types of delivery channels by gambling institutions in becoming more prominent with technological developments such as smartphones and internet platforms. How is it done? During onboarding of clients, using such technologies may obscure or conceal the true identity of the client. It's similar from what we said, that people can obscure the true identity of a client when they're selling the information, when they're sending through the information to an accountable institution. Or alternatively, it may result in clients not being onboarded on a face-to-face basis. Because with technology now, everything is simple. We'll be able to do everything remotely, and then we will conclude the transaction with that, properly verifying the details that you are receiving, whether they are true and they confirm what is required by the FIC Act. In instances where a service provider is used to provide any onboarding technology, such as service provider and technology and the technology process and procedures, they must be properly scrutinized to ensure all required information on clients is obtained and verified. So that's a control that you need to put in place as an accountable institution. You need, if you're using technology, you must be able to indicate that the technology that you have in your environment really covers the requirements that are required by the FIC Act. So now we're going to look at trust company service providers, a delivery channel that might obscure conceal as well, which is similar to the previous two that we have just discussed, non-face-to-face boarding, which may increase the risk of trust service providers being abused by criminals to launder the proceeds of crime. And where an intermediary is used to onboard clients where shell companies or nominee companies are used. So now, if you're using an intermediary and then you don't identify the one body behind the intermediary, that's where you might lose the true nature of the transaction, and then you might forego the risk of identifying the true person who's behind the transaction. And a trust service provider must do proper due diligence on these entities and their businesses and be familiar with the risk mitigation process and procedures such intermediaries or entity may have in place. So as we mentioned a bit earlier, look at the intermediary, look at the person that the intermediary is acting for or on his or her behalf. So now, colleagues, we are continuing, and then this is now we're going to look at digital identity. Please, as we mentioned a bit earlier as well, if you have time, and then for more reading, don't hesitate to just look at these guidance in detail from FATF. They give us some maybe other aspects that we did not cover on this presentation. And then if you have any other questions, don't hesitate again to contact the FIC and then just ask those questions. Just come back to the FIC and say that, no, there's something that you don't understand from the presentation, or you don't understand when it comes to risk-based approach, deliver channel risk or the risk management compliance program, and then we'll be able to assist. And then what is the FATF guidance saying when it comes to digital identity? It says the same thing as we identified on the previous factors as well, where the FATF uses the term of face-to-face and non-face-to-face in categorization business relationship. That would include onboarding and transactions. So what does face-to-face mean? Or when does it occur? It occurs, for example, when parties to the interaction are not in the same physical location and conduct their activities by physical interaction. So that's face-to-face. So face-to-face, it happens when people are sitting in the same space and then they are in person, and then the parties interact and then conduct business face-to-face. And non-face-to-face is an interaction that occurs remotely. It can be through the phone, through email, it can be through any other media platform that we have these days. So that's when the parties are not in the same physical location, and then they're not in the present space, time. They're in the present time, but not in a different space. They could be in a different time as well. When you look at the email, but through the telephone, they could be in a present space. So the interpretive note to recommendation 10 includes that non-face-to-face business relationship or transaction as an example of a potential higher risk situation in undertaking customer due diligence. So the recommendations, again, colleagues, when you look at a risk-based approach, look at what the FATF says. Look at the approach that you need to apply when you are conducting a risk-based approach for your entity. How does this happen according to FATF? It happens by terms that some individuals, for example, can I just go back on that, colleagues? Let me just go back. Now I just lost my chain of thought because I was wobbling and talking all over the place. So I'm going to read the statement again, and then I'm going to interpret it to you after reading to it. So in the interpretive notes to recommendation 10, there's a statement that says non-face-to-face business relationships and transactions. So as an example of a potential high-risk situation is undertaking CDD. By its terms, this statement does not require appropriate authorities and regulated entities to always classify non-face-to-face business relationship or financial transactions as higher risk to money laundering and terrorist financing purposes. Rather, non-face-to-face business relationship and transaction are examples of circumstances where the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing may potentially be higher. So the keyword is may potentially be higher compared to a non-face-to-face business relationship or transactions, and it ends there. So you need to look at a non-face-to-face business relationship and transactions are examples of circumstances where the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing may potentially be higher. Given the evolution of digital ID technology architecture, processes, and the emergence of consensus based on open source digital ID technical standards, it is important to clarify that non-face-to-face customer identification and transactions that rely on reliable independent digital systems with appropriate risk mitigation measures in place may present a standard level of risk and may even be lower risk where higher assurance levels and implemented an appropriate money laundering risk control measures, for example, such as functionality limits and other measures discussed in recommendation 10 and FATF guidance on financial inclusion are present. So colleagues, the next slides we are going to look at delivery channel risk rating for trust company service providers, property practitioners, and legal practitioners, as stipulated or as put forward by FATF again. So we are looking at services which may consider trust company service providers, and in some instances, risk being used to assist money laundering that may include use of pooled clients' accounts or safe custody of clients, money laundering or assets, or better share such as justification. So these are channel risks that you need to identify during the process when you are looking or risk rating delivery channel risk. You should also look at situations where advice on the setting up of legal persons or legal arrangements may be misused to obscure ownership or real economic purposes. That will include setting up of trust companies or other legal entities, or engage or change of names, corporate seat, or establishing complex group structures. This might also include advising in relation to a discretionary trust that gives the trustee discretionary power to name a class of beneficiaries that does not include the real beneficiary. For example, naming a charity as the sole discretionary beneficiary initially, with a view of adding the real beneficiaries at a later stage. So now this one is a simple, actually not simple, I don't want to use the word simple. It's a basic example where people will be trying to hide the real person that they'll be dealing with, instead of looking at the delivery of the product to the specific client, and then now you'll be dealing with the intermediary, and the next person behind the intermediary can't be identified. This might also include situations where a trust is set up for the purposes of managing shares in a company, with the intention of making it more difficult to determine the beneficiaries of assets managed by the trust. So we are also going to look at a delivery channel risk for trust company services providers, highlighted risk. So in this instance, we're going to look at services which may be provided by trust company service providers, and which in some instances look at risk being used to assist money laundering, and that may include, in case of an express trust, an unexplained where explanation there's no explanation, where explanation is warranted, or the nature of classes of beneficiaries and acting trustees of such a trust, or services where trust company services providers may in practice represent or assure the client's standing, reputation, and credibility of third parties without a commensurate knowledge of the client's affairs, or services that are capable of concealing beneficial ownership for competent authorities. So that's the question again, colleagues. Do not forget that this forms part of your RMCP. As much as sometimes it sounds repetitive, when you're looking at RMCP, look at these product risks in detail and then categorize them as we have suggested. But if you think that in your environment there's a far maybe more meaningful or better way to categorize them, please do so, but detail that information on your RMCP and make sure that it says what the risk that you are faced with, and then you analyze it, and then how you're going to mitigate it, how are you going to put measures in place to control it, how are you going to monitor it, and then how are you going to manage it going forward. So please, at all times, colleagues, they might sound repetitive, but they are for us just to look at and make sure that we have enough detail on our MCP to make sure that we cover all the gaps that we might identify. So we're going to, now we're going to look at transactional service and associated delivery channel risk for property practitioners. So these were the highlighted risks. where there are a number of variables that may impact upon risk categories dependent upon all of the surrounding circumstances. So we can look at the involvement of other parties, for example, financial institutions, lawyers or notaries, and whether are they subject to money laundering or terrorist financing. So if you have multi-parties that we are dealing with within an organization, so you have a legal practitioner, you have a property practitioner, and you also have a trust company services provider, or any other. In future, there might be a possibility that accounting practitioners will be added as well. So there could be a transaction that will add all these practitioners, and then for you to determine the type of risk that you're engaged in, you can look at the specific professional that you're dealing with as well, and check if they are they in a space of money laundering, and including in other risks that they might be exposed to. We can check if they are calling themselves accounting practitioners, if they are registered with the relevant authorities that are related to accounting. If the person is a property practitioner, look at that entity and then determine if the specific entity is related or is registered actually to the authority that is supposed to register all property practitioners. And then how the client was introduced to the agent. And then that's the question that we ask when you have third parties, or if you are a property practitioner yourself, how the client was introduced to you. Was it from advertising to social media, or you having a face-to-face engagement, or you are having a face-to-face engagement? The method of communication between the client and the agent. So that's a question that you need to ask as well when you are looking at delivery channel risk. So we're continuing with property practitioners as well. Are there a number of variables that there are a number of variables that may impact upon these risk categories, depending upon all of the surrounding circumstances? The question that you have to look at is whether the underlying client is an important person, politically exposed person, and the risks that are related to a politically exposed person, or whether there is a beneficial owner that is different from the direct customer. The products, services used by the client or the purchaser, the person with whom the real estate agent has a relationship with, for example, a legal person, or arrangements with no clear structure that might pose a higher risk than a natural person. So a complex structure, for example, if you have a company that's, you have a legal person, and then who's entering into a transaction, but that legal person is representing another legal person, and then that legal person as well is representing another legal person, where you have a different form of people representing each other, and the structure within the organization itself, you get that different legal organization within a legal organization own percentages of certain amounts. So sometimes you have to look at that and then just analyze that risk that form of structure poses, and then what is the end goal of the organization, or where is the transaction going to end, and then get into detail of what it entails, or the real person who would be behind that specific transaction. And then also look at an overall risk assessment of a client, and then that should also include determining the potential risk presented by the services offered by a legal professional, for example, and then given the nature of such services, noting the legal professionals provide a broad of diverse range of services for determining the risk associated with the provision of services related to specific activities. Consideration and appropriate weight should be given to such factors. Looking as services where legal professionals effectively acting as financial intermediaries, or they handle the receipt and transmission of funds through accounts they control in the act of facilitating a business transaction. So in this instance, we're looking at a legal practitioner, and then how maybe, or what risk, potential risk they need to look at when they are offering some of their services. Looking at the nature of such services, noting the legal professionals, they provide a broad spectrum or a broad range of activities when it comes to issues related to money laundering and terrorist financing. You can act as a legal practitioner, but at the same time, you can be an intermediary for financial services. So how do you harmonize the risk that is posed by your profession as a legal practitioner or your additional responsibility that you have as a professional in financial services? So that's what you have to look at. Analyze that risk and make sure that you understand it, and then you document it on your MCP, and then you'll have a clear picture of your risk-based approach and how you can manage, mitigate, monitor, and control such risk. And the following slide, we are also looking at delivery channel risk for legal practitioners, where we have to look at transactions and services associated with delivery channel risk for legal practitioners. And then one of the some of the things that were also highlighted by FATF. So one of them is services that allow clients to deposit or transfer funds through the legal profession's trust account that are not tied to a transaction for which the legal professional is performing or carrying out for the activities that are being conducted, or services where the client may request financial transactions to occur outside of the legal professional's trust account. So you must ask yourself, why is the client requesting that? So the account held by a legal professional, so now what detailing what is a trust, what is the legal professional's trust account? This account held by the legal professionals for the client, for example, to the firm's general account and or a personal or business account held by the legal professional himself. So or you can look at services where legal professionals may in practice represent or assure the client's standing, reputation, and credibility to third parties. Now you haven't conducted customer due diligence, and then you vouch for someone that you have not CDD or that they will do a customer due diligence, whether it's enhanced due diligence or advanced due diligence, without the commensurate knowledge of the client's affairs. So that's a question. That's a question that some of us, that's a risk that maybe some legal professionals need to be aware of, and they need to make sure that they put controls in place to eradicate it or minimize it to the lowest levels. Or looking at services that are capable of concealing beneficial ownership from competent authorities. And then we're continuing again with legal professionals, where we're looking at delivery channel risk. And then you should also look at where the legal professional knows that a prospective client has used the services of a number of legal professionals for the same type of services over a relatively short period of time, or a risk that may arise from non-face-to-face relationship and could favor anonymity due to the prevalence of electronic communication between legal professionals and clients in the delivery of legal services and non-face-to-face interaction between legal professionals and clients. That would not be considered a high risk factor on its own, or that including actually the treatment of non-face-to-face communication that we should always be subjected to, and then the approach from legal professionals that they need to take as required by relevant legislation and regulators in the relevant jurisdiction. We should also look at the nature of the referral of origin of the client. So geographic risk, for example, more detail will be given to you colleagues tomorrow. Please don't forget that tomorrow we are discussing a geographic risk, where you are dealing with a prospective client that may conduct a legal professional in an unsolicited manner or without common or customary methods of introduction or referral, which may indicate increased risk. So the probability could be that maybe in their environment or their space of conducting business, money laundering regulations are not similar to what money laundering regulations in South Africa are. So someone who's from a different geographic area might expect that maybe because in his space or his environment, geographic risk or money laundering risk is treated in a certain way, and then in South Africa actually is the same. So you need to apply your mind and understand that no, you should look at those factors and apply what is applicable to your jurisdiction, and then what needs to be done by an accountable institution in your space when you're dealing with such individuals. And then we're going to look at a risk that we highlighted by FATF for gambling sector. So the first issue or the first point that we're going to raises types of payments and payment methods accepted for customers. Types of gambling offered, for example, table games, card games, or electronic games. Are they live or are they automated? Or whether the casinos form part of a bigger organization owned by the same operator. For example, whether the casino operator owns and manages other land-based and or internet casinos. Whether the casino, its operator offers different types of gambling, for example, sports book or premium players. For internet casinos, whether the operator has other websites. For land-based casinos, whether the casino is a standalone or integrated with other larger facilities, for example, a hotel. For hotel, on the previous slides or on the previous communication or presentation, we even look at what a casino junket does when it comes to casinos. So if you have individuals that may be practicing in that space and business, look at what type of risks those individuals pose. Whether the client is wholly based in one country or different jurisdictions, or the presence in multiple countries, for whether internet operators or maybe other forms of gambling that you might get. Staffing numbers, turnover rate, and experience levels. You should look at that. What is the quorum? What is the number of people employed by the entity? Are you looking at the resources of the specific organization? Are they adequate to deal with the number of transactions or businesses that they're entering into? Type and effectiveness of existing supervision mechanism, for example, whether it's electronic or physical. Does he have loyalty clubs issuing loyalty cards, which are monitoring gaming activities? Now, colleagues, we're close to the end, and then we're just going to go to the last two slides before I go back to Ashley to wrap up our session today. So the first one that now we're going to look at the risk rating assessment in whole. What you need to consider as well when you are closing down your risk compliance management program or your risk-based approach. The other issues that you have to look at is identification and assessment. The accountable institution must describe in its RMCP how it assesses risk and identifies product risk. For example, compliance assessment, all different products, and scoring assigned, which is documented, which is reviewed annually. It could be annually, depending on the risk associated with the assessment or the identification and assessment of the client or delivery channel. So if, for example, the client is high risk, you can make sure that you review the client's transaction or the client's profile quarterly instead of annually, so that you make sure that you mitigate the risk that is posed by that high risk client or the high jurisdiction that the client might be coming from, including what is our topic today, delivery channel risk. Or where a new product or service is developed, risk is assessed in the following manner. So we are developing a product, look at the delivery channel risk for the specific product. What risk does that product impose? What delivery risk channel does that product pose? But not forgetting that you're not only looking at delivery channel risk, you look at them wholly and you make sure that you assess, analyze, mitigate, monitor, and manage the risk according to what you have identified. And then now we're going to look at controls that you can look at when you're during risk monitoring, mitigation, and management on treatment of risk. So the controls that you have to look at includes processes, systems, resources, monitoring, reporting, and training. But these are not it and be all. There are other controls that you might put based on the environment that you work in and things that you identify and understand of your environment. For example, if you're a product practitioner, you know your environment better than us as regulators, and then you know your products better than us. You know the delivery channels better than us. The geographic area that you operate in, you'll be more aware because you'll be having your foot on the ground. You'll be the person moving up and down, engaging with clients if you are having a face-to-face engagement, and then that's what you need to look at. The controls must be up in proportion to the risk. For example, a higher risk client or terrorist financing risk, you need to put measures and controls in place that are enhanced. It could be, if it's related to client risk, it could be enhanced due diligence or advanced due diligence, depending on the risk. Medium risk, you put additional controls. If, for example, before you were not requiring a certain aspect of clients, for delivery channel or maybe for identification, for example, you can add that on your control and make sure that you have an additional control to mitigate the risk that you've identified as medium. On lower risk, you just put simplified controls, because we mentioned a bit earlier that in any environment, it's highly unlikely that there'll be a zero risk, depending on the tolerance or risk appetite of an entity. You must have these controls in place. So if you are maybe higher, your company is high risk tolerant, you must have enhanced controls to mitigate the risk. If your entity is low risk tolerant, you must have simplified controls to make sure that you mitigate and you mitigate the risk. But it doesn't mean that if you have low risk, you have to forget about money laundering risk. Go back and check the clients, check the jurisdiction, check the products that you're applying in delivery channels. If they are still in the scope and sphere of low risk, and then are the trends still the same and applicable in a manner that the risk should be treated. Colleagues, the time has come. Thank you very much for availing yourselves, colleagues. And I'll hand over back to Ash, who will proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much, Spoo, and definitely a lot of detail in the slides. There was something, while you were talking, something that I picked up that's so interesting when, we talk about there's a big overlap when we're talking distribution channel in relation to products and CDD, and you touched on those elements quite nicely. And I thought maybe something just to remind the audience is when we look at the factors that constitute risk, it wasn't just plucked from nowhere. You know what I mean? We didn't decide these would be good risk indicators. We had a look at what is the definition of money laundering, and if you have a look at the cycle, because remember, you do something wrong, illegal, you get a proceed of a crime, you take it through that process where you're trying to obscure the origin, and not only obscure the origin, you try to distance yourself. So the perpetrator, the money launderer, tries to distance themselves so far away from A, the source of money potentially, or B, the origin and the money itself, so that they can take it out, bring it back into the economy and make it seem like legitimate money. And distribution risk really sits quite neatly in that instance of obscuring, of distancing yourself. So that's why we say there's an overlap between CDD and an overlap between product, because it really is trying to hide and trying to not be noticed and trying not to engage directly, because the further you are away, the less people know about you. The more heightened the risk is. So that's kind of the context in which you should have a look at distribution channel. Now, distribution channel obviously can't work in isolation, because it's your client firstly and how you engage with your clients, and secondly, it's the product and the service that you offer, and aspects around that product and service that becomes quite relevant. The last thing that I wanted to mention before we get into the questions, and I think it's maybe just a summary, and that it was the one slide that we spoke to on slide 14 when you get the slides, and I think it's a very important starting point is the actual definition, offering of products and services and usage of products and services, and lastly the onboarding of clients. What's also important is, even though you've onboarded a client, remember that relationship can change, and that is why your risk needs to be dynamic. So if you always dealt with this client in a face-to-face engagement, and then all of a sudden, that face-to-face engagement stops and that behavior starts changing, that's when it could potentially be a trigger event. Is this change in behavior, does that make sense for the client? Does that make sense having a look at the rest of the risk indicators? Okay. All right, so I'm going to get into the questions. I see a few new questions coming through. So no, Spoo has stopped presenting. We're moving over to the Q&A. I saw that that question came up. I'm just going to post some of the questions, or if I could maybe ask the moderator, so while I go through the posted questions, if you could maybe just moderate some of the questions coming through. All right, the FIC Act defines a business relationship as an arrangement between a client and accountable institution for the purposes of concluding transactions on a regular basis. What is the understanding of regular basis? All right, so this one, it's really not just the DNFBP sector that asks this question. I think from a money remittance perspective as well, this question often gets asked. And I think the answer lies in not only looking at what the definition of of a business relationship is, but also having a look at the definition of what a single transaction is, because if you read the two together, it's going to give you a better understanding. So it's kind of like that process of elimination, if you want to call it that. So I've got my second screen open here in case you're wondering why I'm looking off into the distance, and it's in Guidance Note 7. So I'm going to refer you to page 29 of Guidance Note 7, as well as page 30 of Guidance Note 7, because in there we talk about the definition of a business relationship, as well as then the definition of a single transaction. Now, what's important, I've scrolled past it. I just want to get to it quickly so that I can give you a proper answer. All right. So on page 30, where it talks about a single transaction, so obviously you know that there's no such thing as anonymous client, but there it says that a single transaction is any occasional or once-off business where there is no expectation on the part of the accountable institution or the client that the engagement would recur over a period of time. So that, and obviously provided that it's above the 5,000 Rand threshold, that is what a single transaction is. Then if you have a look at the flip side and you look at the definition of a business relationship on page 29 of the guidance product, there it says it's defined as an arrangement between the client and the AI for purposes of concluding transactions on a regular basis, and a business relationship therefore entails an element of time duration to the engagement with the client. Now, what the guidance also says then is very important for every accountable institution to have a look at these definitions, have a look at your product and service offerings, and determine, okay, so what is it? What does our product, how does that map towards the definitions? So we can't provide guidance on, this particular product is definitely a business relationship. Have a look at the time element. Does someone come in, exchange money and leave, or is there a relationship in the sense that it's ongoing, and there's, you don't just see the client today and then tomorrow you're never going to see them again. Okay, the element of time is very important, and unfortunately we can't tell you what that time period is. So again, go have a read through 29 and 30, pages 29 and 30 rather. Okay, I'm just going to filter through the most liked questions. That was the most liked. There we go. Is the expectation that supervisory bodies and accountable institutions will have separate risk assessments? For example, client type supervisory bodies are responsible for new licenses, and market entrants, and accountable institutions are responsible for new gambling clients. And it looks, I'm not too sure who posted the question, but your name is supervisory body, so I'm assuming this is coming from a supervisory body. So yeah, I think it's a very valid question. So if we take you back to recommendation 1 and the whole purpose behind risk understanding, you get the national risk assessment, sector risk assessment, institutional level, and then within institutional level, how you actually go granular and understand what that is or how that risk is applied to your clients, your product offerings and services. So from a supervisory perspective or from a sector risk assessment perspective, the FIC in collaboration with the supervisory bodies went through an exercise of assessing the risk. So that was through questionnaires, international best practice, having a look at the reports that got submitted through to the FIX, so we could do trend analysis and identify themes and topics, etc. So we have a very like a bird's eye view. So we have a holistic understanding of the industry, and we have an understanding of, you know, what general products can be used within your industry to be abused to facilitate money laundering and terrorist financing. We need to obviously then take it a step further. So if you have a look at immediate outcome 3, that was the supervision requirements. And one of the requirements under IO 3 or immediate outcome 3 is we need to have a solid understanding, a risk understanding and a risk assessment, so that we would then be able to identify who needs to be reviewed. So just like how you have a look at who are your high risk clients and who you need to apply enhanced due diligence, including monitoring, supervisory bodies need to also be able to unpack which of their accountable institutions present a higher risk. We also look at the national risk assessment and the sector risk assessment. Then we have a look at more granular information, you know, because remember, you are registered on GoAML, you do submit reports to us, we do understand the industry you're in, so we would then have an understanding of what risk your entity could potentially pose. Off of that determination, we would then be able to identify who we need to select for an inspection. All right, so it's not just a willy-nilly, we pick a name out of a hat. We also need to apply a risk-based approach. So the higher the risk, the more likely you are to be selected for an inspection. Okay, so that is our view when we do risk assessments of accountable institutions. The second part then to your question, and okay, so part of that's market entry criteria, etc., is also important. That's also a principle from a FATF perspective, is to prevent bad actors from getting into a position of power. And by position of power, we mean get into as a DNFBP. And why don't you want bad actors heading up DNFBPs? And that takes us back to the discussion we've had over the last 2 weeks. DNFBPs, you guys are seen as gatekeepers. You open the gate to allow people to get into the financial market, to get into the economy, which would then facilitate the flow of funds. Why? Because generally people buy cars, houses, they try to put money into trusts or into corporate entities and companies, which is why you're all here. They try to gamble the money away. Okay, so that's why your industries are susceptible to abuse. A money launderer doesn't only have to be a client; they can also be part of the ownership structure of a DNFBP. So not only could you, as I'm going to use an example, a legal practitioner for argument's sake, you might not only be used to facilitate abuse, there might be some legal practitioners out there that themselves are money launderers and are using the profession to hide behind. So that is the element that market entry tries to correct, to make sure that bad actors don't get into those positions. All right. So the view is different. Okay, oh, that's awesome. Now you're going to be able to update your RMCPs effectively. Please just join us for the geographic risk tomorrow. Can we get a copy of the latest FIC Act? Definitely. So when you get the slides on the 3rd or 4th page, I think are all the links. There is a copy or a link to the soft copy. Obviously with COVID, we haven't met people face to face. We're not planning for the rest of our financial year, which ends next year, March. To meet people face to face. So if you're looking for an actual hard copy book, it might only come around next year. Okay, but for now, you're more than welcome to make use of the soft copy. I just want to check that I've gone through all the questions. Oh, here's another one. If a client visits attorney's practice and only wants once-off advice, pay consultation fee, does the client need to be full FICA'd ID and proof of address? So remember, your CDD obligations remain pretty much the same. It's just those additional requirements when you get to, asking questions around source of funds, source of wealth, etc. It could be argued, and again, I can't tell you if once-off advice is going to be a business relationship or considered a single transaction. That is something that your organisation needs to have a look at. Have a look at the time element. Are they returning? Is it above 5,000 Rand? So you really need to make that determination. But either way, whether it's a single transaction or whether it's a business relationship, you still need to risk assess. You still need to apply your customer due diligence. remember, the Act no longer says a copy of ID and a copy of utility bill. The Act says you need to establish and verify the identity of a client. That is the minimum requirements, and then it goes on to persons acting on your client's behalf. If it is the lowest form of risk, the minimum requirement is then to be able to establish and verify the identity. The higher the risk, obviously, the higher the obligation goes. Okay, I think that's all the questions that was then posted. I'm just doing a quick check. Yeah, no, we've definitely covered everything. So I'm going to leave it there then. Thank you so much again for your attendance. We are hosting another session this afternoon, so if you weren't able to attend all of it this morning, or if you want to listen to it again, you're more than welcome to click on the link that was sent out in the confirmation email. Yeah, and then I guess we're going to see you tomorrow for our last session on geographic risk. Enjoy the rest of the day. If you're in Gauteng, I hope you keep warm. It is a freezing day today, but all the best. God bless, and we'll chat soon. Cheers all.